So we can, at this point, probably get started. And I want to welcome everyone to our panel. A little bit of context on why we kind of landed on this topic is that we noticed that there was this trend around where I want to say maybe in the early 2010s, everyone started getting onto using apps and familiar with them, and everyone and their uncle had an idea for an app. And the argument was, hey, I know how to use apps, so I should know how to make one, right? And then I think that's really great because they kind of crowdsourced these ideas. And not to say all those ideas were bad. Everyone, their uncle, their aunt, deserve to have these ideas, and platforms like Apple's SDK really allow them to not have to worry about some of the foundational things, and then have some of those ideas come to life. And things like Uber may not have existed if that kind of platform enablement wasn't there. And we've seen a similar transition now onto kind of specifically the developer community, where myself included, hey, I've consumed APIs before. How hard could it be to publish an API and make it just as easy for someone else? And similar to like, while a lot of app ideas were great, there were some that weren't great. And then somewhere in between where there were some that were great that didn't quite make it because there were some foundational best practices maybe that they didn't have the benefit of. So what I'm looking to do with my co-panelists here is share some of our lessons learned on putting together developer ecosystems or API and SDK-based platforms to hopefully shed some light on those best practices so that we can kind of move more of those ideas that folks have, more of the use cases that we have from the maybe bucket into the good bucket, because we can learn from the experiences gained here. So I'm going to do a brief introduction of our two panelists and then have them talk a little bit more about their own backgrounds. First off, we have Aimme Keener. Aimme and I have known each other for a few years. Aimme is a software engineer and has been in the industry for over 20 years, a huge proponent for extreme programming and agile, and really bringing empathy to the software engineering process. Aimme and her husband live with their 17-year-old daughter, who is taking her SAT today, good luck, in Michigan. And as someone who grew up overseas watching Home Improvement, knowing very little bit about North America back then, but my window into Michigan was that there was Tim the Toolman that lives there with his family and had a hot rod in the basement, or in their garage rather, and finding out that Amy's husband builds hot rods, I thought was very validating of the image that I had of Michigan before I moved here. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we have Rajeev Chhajer, who is here from 99P Labs. Rajeev has been in the software and product industry for over 16 years, doing various roles from software to systems engineering to product. And Rajeev is also a huge proponent of agile and human-centered design. Rajeev and his wife live in Ohio, close to Columbus, with their 7-year-old daughter. So kind of kicking things in, maybe I'll start with Aimme. Aimme, tell us, maybe add to what I said, kind of tell us how you've gotten into this role of working with SDKs and developer APIs.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So thank you for the great introduction. Everything you said is true. I've been in the industry longer than I'd like to say. I've spent my entire career in Detroit. I came here with a marketing degree and ended up in technology. I don't know how it happened, but it did. I've worked as a consultant, a full-time employee. I've been in finance, education, and automotive. And like you mentioned, I really found my fit when I found agile software development. And I really think that leads into why I like building SDKs and being part of a developer community. Just because I learned in agile software development that community and being there for each other and supporting each other and making things easier for each other is so important. That's why you'll see me in the community here in Detroit. I used to throw put on Michigan Agile Enthusiasts for years, and now I'm an organizer for DevOps Days Detroit and still for Agile and Beyond. We're excited to come to you again in 2022. We have plans, was able to get my introduction into SDKs because I joined a startup in 2018. So it's nice being able to get onto something on a ground floor. And I work for a company called Autonomic, where we're trying to build the world's largest transportation mobility platform, largest connected vehicle platform. And, it's exciting to be about a part of a company that's thinking about the next generation of transportation and about, changing what transportation looks like in a 100-year-old company, which is fun. I got into this role here specifically at Autonomic because I started working out with developers in the field and hearing what their concerns were with our services and how they were using them. Also hearing what was cool about them as well and seeing the cool things that they were able to do in it. And one of the things that we identified as a company was that there was a need for a team that actually built and supported these tools and libraries and code bases and examples that really helped give people a leg up on the platform and allowed them to work quickly.
And I wanted to clarify something or get your opinion on something here. You mentioned APIs as well as SDKs. When you look at some of the available tools out there, some of them have both APIs and SDKs, like Autonomic and TMC do, and some of them have just the API. And so if I was on a developer team and we had just APIs and we're debating about, should we do an SDK or not do an SDK, let our kind of consumers figure that out. Why might you kind of advise folks around building an SDKs for your tools?
Well, APIs are awesome, because they're a generic connectivity interface to an underlying application, and they're great, and they're sometimes all something that they need. But if you have something that's more complex, I definitely recommend going with an SDK. Because SDKs provide like library and compiled code that's already available, along with documentation and sample codes on how to use those APIs. So it's much more tangible. Things that people can touch versus just reading or trying to figure out how to use and put the steps together. An SDK will hide a lot of the underlying implementation, so you don't have to know about the base platform and how it works and the technologies behind it. It kind of simplifies all of that. And if an SDK can also protect your backend system from bad things happening because it knows the good patterns and it knows things to be able to look for. And so I just love the simplification that an SDK provides because it really allows the developer to focus on their business problem versus focusing on learning like our platform, our technologies. I've seen developers struggle learning how to use an API and get up running in minutes with an SDK and an example.
Awesome. That's really useful context. I'm going to switch gears over to you, Rajeev. Let's hear a little bit more about maybe how you got to the role you're in. Tell us about 99P Labs, why it exists, and what you're up to.
Absolutely. Ashok, thanks for having me on this panel today. It's a very exciting topic for me, and I'm obviously looking to learn a lot from Aimme here as well. But for the audience, again, I'm Rajeev. I lead the CASE, that's the Connected Autonomous Shared Electrified Data Innovation and Research at 99P Labs. For context, 99P Labs is an innovation lab backed by Honda and the Ohio State University. This is physically located on the OSU campus itself, but my background is from the automotive side and I lead the connected technologies research there. Essentially, 99P Labs was formed to do technology and customer value research in the intersection of future mobility, energy, and data. And in that space, focusing on the data stack that goes along with the future mobility ideas and trends, I think that's where that's where I landed this role to lead these activities at 99P Labs. So
awesome. And so with this joint partnership. I've gotten to see your offices that are on campus, and it's whether you're thinking about it from like the Ohio State or university standpoint, or from a really large company like Honda. I got to say the snacks that you have are a lot better than what I expected from either. In definitely a very awesome office. So, Rajeev, for you, what are some of the main differences that your team has come around with making customer-facing APIs versus APIs that you were making before that other folks within 99P or your partner organizations were consuming?
Yeah, I think so. I think to put things in context, we our organization's role is very much focused on research, right? And one of the big things that we are trying to work on a daily basis is to build a collaborative research community, just because philosophically we think that the problems that need to be solved in the future mobility, energy, and a society point of view is a very large problem and needs to be done collaboratively with a lot of different types of folks, right? And one of the assets that we have is the mobility and energy data sets that we can bring up to the community of researchers, whether they're part of a university, public-private organization, startup. And using that, those mobility energy data sets, we want to try to address some of the challenging problems in the mobility and energy space as well. So for that, what we've done is we've built what we call as a research asset, but it is essentially the 99P Labs developer portal, which is already public live right now, where we use that as an opportunity to surface our data sets, our problems, the challenges to a larger number of people, where we can not only get their insight, but also provide the resources and move fast in solving some of these problems. And as part of that, the data sets that we provide, we've gone the route of providing them as API. So you can think of it very much like a transactional developer portal, but mainly focused on data science and data analytics as well.
Awesome. And for those folks who are listening that want to hit up the developer portal, can you spell out the address?
Yeah, it's developer.99plabs.io.
.io. Cool. Thank you. And how about you, Amy? I think you've also probably learned some stuff around, you used to build and consume APIs before that other team members would consume, and now you're doing it for your customers. What are some of the things that maybe you've learned that are different?
It's I've learned that a lot of things are different. I think we forget that when you develop something internally, that you're all usually used to the same technologies, you're used to the same domain, talking in the same language, and that you don't have to give a whole lot of examples or even a lot of documentation, because they can reach out to you over Slack or schedule a meeting with you if they are familiar, or just look through all the organization's repos and see somebody else who's integrated with you. So you always have to remember that when you're working with someone externally, that they're starting from a basis of potentially nothing. They don't know anything about your domain. They don't know anything about your platform. And you have to start there. I think the biggest learning lesson I learned was like, I do agile software development. I do XP. I believe in solid principles. I'm very empathetic. I've got a lot of opinions about what makes a bad API, but it's still really hard to do when you're developing for someone else, because other people come with different lenses and experiences. I'm developing APIs for systems that I necessarily haven't consumed in the past. So I'm learning from people who may have consumed more things like that and things that they know of what are easier to do. So I definitely have blind spots and have to work over those blind spots. I also have to be extremely open to feedback, and specifically negative feedback, because I bet if I get 10 pieces of feedback, 9 of them are negative and only 1 is positive, if I'm lucky. So to be able to take that and to be able to do that. I think the other, when I work with a team internally, like I know I'm impacting their business and their revenue. But when it comes outside of you, like when you think like, hey, I'm impacting someone else's business and revenue, that actually becomes scarier to me, because I don't want a newspaper article written about me, you know, about something that I've done. So I think about that a lot. So now I spend a ton of time talking to developers that don't even, you know, aren't in my company, hearing, you know, what problems they're trying to solve. I've learned I've had to become an expert in the APIs that I'm creating SDKs for. Because, you know, I have to be able to answer every question that comes about it. I can't say, I don't know. That sounds like a question for the service team, because there may be blind spots, again, that we're not thinking about. I write a ton of documentation, which I know every Agile, and Agile doesn't say don't document, but, you know, like documentation, be lightweight. I write a lot of examples now, or as a team, we write a lot of examples to show the power of the SDK and its features. And another thing that I do is we have a Slack channel that has all the customer issues and complaints that come in through our Zendesk tracking system. And I watch those come in like a hawk, just to see, you know, what is the feedback that we're getting? What are things that we might need to change, so that we can iterate quickly and help people? And you know, when you develop a piece of software internally, lots of times people are forced to use it because it's on the internal team. But when I'm developing an SDK for someone else to use, I often think about game development. Like, what do I have to do that will, you know, bring them in and entice them to stay to learn the next feature, so that they'll keep leveling up in their experience in using the SDK. So those are some differences that I've had between internal and external software development.
That's really great. So looking for feedback, putting love into documentation, examples, watching the Zendesk issues yourself. Don't end up on the newspaper. Those seem like some takeaways here.
Yeah.
I know that you've always been a huge proponent of human-centered design, and something that may be new for folks, depending on the environment they're typically working in, is this process of customer discovery. And some maybe thinking of like, oh, that's marketing's job. Whereas we know from agile teams, bringing that into the team is pretty important. And when we're doing APIs, especially something so technical, it kind of starts to edge closer and closer into sort of the engineering teams or technology teams sort of responsibilities and accountability. So do you have any stories about doing customer discovery there?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot, right, over the past year when we've gone from working from home. I'll share a story from when we were in the office. We knew where there was a large group of developers that we were going to use our SDKs were sitting. So we literally would go over there, just drop in on an afternoon. We typically dropped in when our field engineering team was around, because they could often point us out to teams or introduce us to people. And we would just walk up and we'd say like, hey, we really need someone to try out our authentication SDK. And, you know, we'd sit them down and we'd watch them do it. We'd watch them install it. We'd watch them run it. We'd watch if they read our documentation or not. We watched everything that they did. And that helped us improve our SDKs. It helped us improve, did they make sense? We learned, like there was this one time, I think I had written like 20 pages of documentation. They read none of them. They just downloaded our example and ran it. Another thing, we internally are still a big Maven shop, but our end users are big Gradle users. So we had to learn that we had to double down on Gradle, because we've provided Maven. That was going to be a barrier to entry to some people. And, we learned, like I said, we learned that examples were huge, and it was great. It was great just being able to walk around. Some people we kind of ambushed. We weren't sure if they were going to need it or not. And then there were other teams that we definitely knew that needed it. We just had sent emails with them. We hadn't met them personally, hadn't necessarily been invited to a meeting. So it was nice to get to meet with them face to face. Now that we're in work from home, we still do that. We still ask when we're getting features there, we're going to develop a new feature, or we're going to deliver a feature. We always ask our more customer-facing teams, or teams that might be useful to it. I also keep track of teams that say, file a support ticket for a feature that maybe we're developing, and to reach out to them to get it tested and to get feedback. I'm not afraid to delay a release if it's not exactly right. Again, trying to avoid not being in a newspaper article. You know, it's important to deliver something. I don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, but it's like writing that fine line and making sure that you know that you're delivering something that's helpful and not harmful. And that, you know, I'm also trying not to create more work for my more customer-facing teams. Right? I don't want field engineering to have a whole bunch of work because I released a feature. I want them to be able to have a lot of supporting pieces that can support them as well.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. Thank you. We got some folks in the audience that have some questions, and either of you are welcome to jump in here. So the first question I'll ask the question that was typed in, and then I'll come to Glenn, who's raised their hand. So the question here is, how do you deal with the limitations of vendor APIs when building API-heavy products? So this is advice as a consumer to some extent.
As a consumer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So as a consumer, I would recommend giving feedback. You know, if sometimes people don't know what you're looking for and what you need. It's always great if you can provide them a sample piece of code or a test that you wrote showing how you got around their limitation or what their limitation caused you not to be able to do. I think in this day and age, you can really impact teams' roadmaps of items. So I would definitely always speak up and provide examples and be willing to help, because as someone who submits a request to us probably gets I don't know if it's the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but it gets my attention, especially if it's something that hasn't been on my mind to start thinking about, and definitely something that I will speak over with my product owner.
Anything specifically that you think they may have, like, what's something in an issue that might really get your attention? Is it a joke? Is it implication of what the limitation is? Is there anything that's super helpful for you to help prioritize?
Yeah, understanding the business problem. Like, what is it not allowing them to do? What's the what feature can they not develop? What problem can they not solve for their customer? Those things, you know, really weigh on me, because that's how I'm prioritizing my work internally. So any information in that is helpful.
Awesome. Okay. So sounds like don't be afraid to get their attention and give feedback through the different avenues that the API provider has. Make sure to articulate the business problem that's being limited, and then code samples as well, to really get into the meat of it. Awesome. It looks like where there isn't a raised hand anymore. So maybe we'll get back to some of the things that I wanted to talk about. Amy, you mentioned API design and talked about it a little bit. Rajeev, I'm wondering how your team thinks about API design, especially when the consumers of your APIs don't necessarily speak the same language, literally and figuratively, and or kind of have the same norms and internal lingo. So what are some things maybe your team does?
Yeah, so I think, again, for us, going back to the context, right, like our APIs that we're offering are focused towards large scale mobility data sets, right? And I think as the engineering team generally understand what the API should look like and things like that, but very early on, we were always thinking about, if data is the product that we want to be delivering, or intelligence is the product that we want to be delivering, how should we package that, right? And we starting with the traditional CSV methods, and like, should we give storage access or things like that? But we very quickly, you know, obviously went towards saying that can we package these large scale data sets as APIs, and can we use the way APIs are used for application purposes in that fashion, right? We made some hypotheses, we made some assumptions around those architectures, around what sort of framework we want to use. We did go with GraphQL with a REST sort of response. Things that we considered were the querying capabilities, filtering capabilities, but more specifically, because they're geospatial time series sort of data sets, we focused on the date range as a big part of that design as well. Performance metrics was a big part of it, because at the end of the day, if the data itself, the quantity and quality of data was not being delivered as part of the API, the researcher or the community member would very quickly go away as well. So those were some of the things that we were thinking about, at least while designing our APIs. But very quickly, we ran into I wouldn't say issues, but we got a lot of feedback from the community around even simple steps like we've used APIs ourselves, but when we started developing APIs, we sort of forgot about the user experience of using those APIs as well. And that was a big miss on our part, and our community members were very fast in helping us point that out. And you could think of the simple experience like, you log into the portal, then you have to go to the API store, get an API key, generate an application, use that key in your code, then test out the API. So there's so many steps in that experience that potentially a developer needs to go through. And very quickly, we wanted to understand how can we abstract things that are non-beneficial for the developer from a user point of view, and try to put it, which is where we started also moving towards the idea of SDKs, because it allows you to abstract all the unnecessary work that the developer would need to do, but and can focus on the business problem too.
Awesome. Helping the developers focus on their business problems. Right. And an interesting thing I think you mentioned, similar to Amy, was around customer discovery, right? You got feedback or you got concerns. There is this catch-22, especially for startups where, hey, we don't have any customers, so we don't have any analytics. So how do I get feedback? Yeah. And how do you, is there any advice? What have you done in the past to kind of get feedback on something you haven't built yet?
No, that's a great question. We experienced a very similar situation, right? We had this constant amount of time talking to potential community members, right? And we defined what a community potentially looked like as well. We wanted to leverage our university network that we had established to say that, okay, this is the first sort of community we want to go after. So we had conversations. I think from those conversations, without having built anything, what we developed was a hypothesis around what we think the community will want and what will help us solve the business problem. So the approach that we took with our software engineering processes was this whole idea of MVP, right? Minimum viable product. Let's build something, keep it agile, keep the user in the loop, and ship it to them in sort of a closed, maybe a beta sort of way. That way we can generate feedback, talk to them, have those one-on-one conversations, understand whether we have really validated the hypothesis for what we built, or are we invalidating, and the user itself is saying something else after they can touch, feel, see the product in itself. So we've done many iterations in that fashion. And I think I have learned in that process that if there is an intent, you just need to find your first 5 to 10 people who can be your early adopters and who are not willing to not share information and give you feedback. I think that gets the ball rolling essentially.
Awesome. So you kind of inch your way there. Sounds like some takeaways. You started, like anyone who's heard me step on the soapbox has heard a lot of these things, where you started out by defining your persona or maybe a smallest viable market in order to get to your MVP. And then you defined a hypothesis, you made it well aware amongst all the stakeholders on your team what that hypothesis is, had an MVP out there to test it. And then the interesting thing here, I think, is that you also kind of sought out folks who were more vocal, more willing to share. having tried to, and sometimes successfully, had conversations with legal, branding, governance folks at like two large institutions that you're sort of beholden to, I was very scared, right? When the first time someone told me, yep, you're gonna have to go talk to legal about that, for some reason, like that was my first exposure to legal. I thought I was gonna go to jail, or that's kind of the fear that kind of popped out of my head immediately. What's some advice for someone who, if someone says, hey, you're gonna have to get legal approval or governance approval on that, especially when you're working, as a small organization as part of two big organizations?
Yeah. So that whole part was not at all intuitive for me, right? It was a learning process, honestly. And in hindsight, there's learning. So when you look at our whole process, right, very quickly, intuitively, we know that we have to do a lot of the engineering problems. So we start solving those, right? Then we slowly, from engineering, we move to the idea of, okay, what are the operating principles around the community that you want to be doing, right? So you build those practices around that. You start thinking about, how do you want to build feedback mechanisms? How do you want to interact with the community? How do we push updates to the community faster? So that also tends to get very much in the team's thought process. But what was not intuitive is the question that you asked, right? Like, you build very fast, you build all these practices, but we forget about the organizational considerations that need to happen, right? And think about it from a viewpoint of risk management, right? Now, risk management, you can think about it from either a brand point of view, or you can think about it from a security viewpoint, governance viewpoint, the many different aspects to it, right? And all these terms sound very heavy, but in my own experience, I wish I would have engaged these sort of groups early on. I think the important point is to communicate the value proposition, your intent of what you are trying to accomplish, right? And I think those conversations with attorneys or risk folks really help build the guardrails that you would actually need to put your developer portal, your developer community, your APIs, put it into practice. And also, I think the other benefit that comes out of it is that because of those discussions, you can potentially automate things early on in your software engineering or development processes. Otherwise, it becomes after the fact kind of things you need to consider as well. So again, I feel like it shouldn't be viewed as a negative thing, but a way to engage them early on, because I feel like they have the best interest in, as long as they understand the point of view and the objective of your activity.
Awesome. Yeah, I think oftentimes if we think about these lenses of human-centered design, of customer desirability, technical feasibility, business viability, we start to think of de-risking in those three lenses. And something that I definitely feel like makes sense that that resonates is that there are internal stakeholders that can also be risks to the success or the viability or feasibility. So just like we would kind of going and de-risking the scariest feeling things first, talking to legal, talking to governance, getting them involved in the process early rather than later makes a ton of sense. And
absolutely,
having done this myself in my experience, they often are just as appreciative, right? They're like, hey, thank you so much for not telling me that you need to launch something in 2 weeks, where it puts a lot of pressure on me. And instead, I can be part of the ideation. And if there's anytime someone says legal would never allow that, or that would never get passed by the FDA, they can get involved and say, actually, the FDA guidelines say this. So here are your guardrails, go crazy inside there. And those constraints lead to better creativity and ideation as well, I think. So super helpful. We've got an audience question here. And Aimme, since it's around SDKs, maybe I'll see if you have an opinion. So Sean here has a question about, how do you approach troubleshooting customer difficulties in using your SDKs?
That's a great question, because it is a black box, right? It's deployed on somebody else's machine, their other cloud somewhere, and that does make it quite difficult to troubleshoot. What we have tried to do is, one is have a set of questions that we ask people, so that when they report an issue, so that we can get better information from them. We've learned, and that may be like, what version are you running? Exactly what was the error message that was printed? because a lot of times with that, or what exactly are you seeing? And try to get down to specifics. We learn a lot of what these issues are and what people see. So then we actually go back to our documentation friend and document them and put them on a troubleshooting page. So hopefully people can help themselves better, or sometimes add better documentation to get people over or improve our example. But 9 out of 10 times, both of those things, if they tell us exactly what's happening, we either know what it is immediately because we've seen it before, and we can refer them to documentation that will help them get around it, as well as maybe let them know, hey, we've got something that's going to come out and make this better. If we can't do that, then it usually involves, us getting on a phone call or, something like this to talk it through them so that we can see exactly the issue that they're experiencing. So that either we can help them solve it right there, or again, it's one of those another feedback experience. Okay, now I understand the business problem that you have, and I understand that why what I've provided you isn't working or isn't helpful.
So this is sort of similar to like a new internal challenge that pops up where we used to be in person, like you used to be maybe when you could walk by with your field engineers and go hang out next to your customers and watch them do it. And now it's, Zendesk tickets, maybe over like an open community Slack. And I really love how you said, you know what, sometimes we just hop on the call. And it's the same thing that we're kind of a new norm that we're working on internally, where if the problem solving is getting hard back and forth over a Slack message, hey, let's remember that we could always hop on a call. And I wonder, is there any encouragement you have for folks who are trying to remind their engineering teams that maybe don't typically think about hopping on a customer call? I know I didn't historically. How do you get people kind of thinking that way? Any tips there?
I think it becomes like a team practice. I mean, obviously, I think it's something that the leaders of the teams need to embody, and that communication is important, and working with people is important, and talking with other people is important. So I just think that constant reminder of it just becoming part of your team's toolkit of the way that you solve things, and it's a regular tool that you use, makes it easier. So sometimes defaulting to communication all the time makes it easier to know when you shouldn't later on. So I usually just try to make it a team practice, and something that we try to become good at, and then learn how to tone down that muscle or not flex it as much as we learn more what it serves its purpose most.
Awesome. And while you have your kind of team leadership hat on here, there's another thing that you brought up about documentation, right?
Oh, yeah.
I was maybe an anomaly as an engineer who wasn't an engineer for very long in my career, where the senior engineer on our team sat me down. He said, hey, we really like reading your documentation and your requirements way more than we like reading your code. And that kind of set me on a journey from being a software engineer to a product manager. That's not the case for everyone. Documentation can sometimes be a bad word. They may not always have a savior like myself to take the documentation on. Any tips on how you've gotten engineers excited about doing documentation or seeing more of the value of it?
I think it comes back to, again, from a leadership perspective of like getting everyone excited about what you're delivering, and that it can't just be code, right? What's that experience? Think back to the SDK that you love the most, or the tool that you love using the most. Yes, it should be intuitive and easy to use, but from an API perspective, from a developer, have you referred to their documentation? Was it good? Was it not good? I also accept a lot of feedback from the developers on my team who says, like, I don't want to write 20 pages of documentation. I want to write one, So it's like, okay, well, how do we make that one page the best that we can be? How do we not duplicate it? Let's not have duplicate documentation in multiple spots. Let's put it in one spot. We've gotten feedback recently that maybe we shouldn't write a whole lot of documentation in our dev portal. Instead, maybe we should put that documentation in the code. So we try a lot of different things, but I try to really focus on, like, what's your experience? What SDK as a developer have you used and do you love? And why do you love it? And it'll often come back to ease of use, or if I have a question, I can find the answer quickly. And it's like, those are the same things that we want in our SDKs, and let's add that there. And it's usually, if you're pretty excited about it, And if they have a customer who says like, oh, great, I found my answer, or, you know, one of our field engineering teams, if team members, if they're said like, great, I found the answer on the dev portal, that gives a lot of positive feedback to, you know, like help see that the documentation is worthwhile.
That makes a lot of sense. So kind of empowering the folks through their own influence and memories of what they got really engaged by, and then helping them be problem solvers to create that for your customers as well. And you know, it's no different now that I think about it of, I don't want to write 20 pages of code if I can write 1 page of code, and maybe there's an art associated with that, and maybe similarly with the documentation too. We have an audience question here from Azen that I'm going to switch over to. What are the challenges of customer discovery when the product is actually targeting a new category? Rajeev, you talked about kind of defining your early market and then switching to there. Any thoughts about this or any experience that you have?
I think it's a very experimentation model, right? Like you have to build hypotheses and then keep continually going and validating or invalidating your hypotheses, really, and then trying to narrow down. And I mean, it goes back to your objective as well. And if something is sort of matching, I think there is an opportunity to say that, okay, maybe I feel good about this. The data at least matches up with what we're thinking over here from customer discovery, even if it's a new category, right? And trying to at least to do something really quick, experimental model, and go build something and test it out, validate it. I think it's, again, going in with the whole mindset of experimentation and validating, invalidating your hypothesis. I think, I don't know if there's an exact formula, even if it's a new category, but the experimental model definitely works well.
Awesome. And, you know, as part of that, I want to switch gears maybe a little bit about something we got to talk about around community.
Yeah.
Right. If, to Amy's point, if you think about some of the best SDKs, some of the best APIs out there, something that seems to come up often is, yeah, they just have a great community where even if the folks from Stripe or whoever aren't necessarily answering our questions, there's just a whole bunch of folks who are consumers that are really excited to hop in. I know in some cases, product managers or lead engineers will be scouring Stack Overflow themselves and looking for any questions about their APIs where their company's tagged. What has it been like setting up a community for you with this partnership that you have going with the university and other researchers?
Yeah, it's been interesting as we've built, I mean, when we started building our first version of the developer portal, as I mentioned, we soft launched it to our partners at The Ohio State University, and got some early feedback, slowly started building on top of that. So within the community, within the university network itself, you know, we originally had a hypothesis around undergraduate students, which very fast went into graduate students, researchers, faculty, and they started, you know, organizing events. We thought maybe bringing the portal to events like hackathons or, you know, class workshops or capstone projects would generate that kind of feedback for us in terms of, you know, what are the challenges? How does it tie back to the use case that they're using? Can we build generic APIs, or do we need to have sort of custom APIs based on use cases? So those sort of questions came up, and every time we do some activity with students or researchers, faculty, there's always new feedback, and it's just about how quick we iterate on top of that then.
Awesome. And how about you, Amy? Any thoughts on community development for your platform?
So we're trying a variety of different things. You know, we're still a paid for platform, so we don't have that open community type of yet. But, you know, we do have blogs. We have newsletters that go out to our users. We have field engineering that's out in the field, as well as platform evangelists. And we also hold tech talks internally as well. But we're still in that beginning phases, I would say, of building community.
Makes sense. Yeah, I'm sure it makes a huge difference. And not everyone can probably compare um, the model that they have for their business compared to Stripe, to your point, which is a very open, easily accessible community that is naturally going to have that many more users and consumers compared to maybe an enterprise to enterprise type of deal where your community is limited. So that makes a ton of sense. I think in both cases, there's probably a little bit more need to subscribe to coding standards that span organizations versus maybe a set of standards you can have within yours. So Aimme, I know you've got a ton of experience and opinion around coding principles, standards. What are some things that your teams does maybe to kind of align with standards that you may predict your consumers might subscribe to as well?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you have to think more, what I like to say, globally versus locally. So things that may be happening internally, but look externally. So it's most easy if we follow standards that are out in the community already. So like it's really easy if I say something like, well, Google does this, because people usually accept what Google does or follows their standards. Another one is, we're replacing some technologies and tools that are currently being used. So if we follow standards that are similar to those that we're replacing, it usually brings some comfort of some level that we're doing that. We also try to make sure that, because lots of people are reading our code and using our code that aren't in our company, right, that we follow good programming standards. So we do test-driven development. We do static code analysis and follow common rules there as well, just to make sure that that we're meeting industry standards and guidelines. And I think one of the best places to look for it is, in the W3C, they have a gazillion working groups. They have so many RFCs that you can't believe. But if you follow that and you follow the standards that are written there, you get a lot of credence as well, because those are usually seen as the governing body. So the more open standards that you can follow that are accepted, the better.
Awesome. Yeah, I think W3C comes up often. It can be a little intimidating. So what was it like maybe getting involved or joining the working groups there and learning from them?
Yeah, well, joining the working groups there is fun and interesting. It's you need a sponsor to get onto a working group, and luckily we had some people in our company that were already on a few working groups. So unfortunately, I don't have an experience of just joining without a friend. I wish I could share that. But it's interesting because I'm on a couple automotive working groups, and when we join, we talk about we get to see what Land Rover's doing, and Toyota or Honda necessarily what they're doing and what they're doing with connected vehicle data. And it's really interesting because you can tell with everyone that everybody's just on the ground floor and the basics. And it's interesting to watch how the industry grows. But it's just like anything, right? If you were in a working group or there was an architecture group or any organization in your company, you get as much out of it as you put into it. So, if I'm just going to sit around and be a bystander, then I'm just going to be a bystander and learn and get the documents. So, if I want to be involved and I want to be influential, it takes effort.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Looking at the time here, we have under 10 minutes left. Were there any other questions that folks from the audience had for the panelists, myself? As we give folks the opportunity to maybe type up any more questions, I'm gonna kind of selfishly maybe take the conversation to something that I'm pretty passionate about, something that our teams are solving. Both the auth concept, both authentication and authorization to the APIs have a different set of considerations now in terms of who you want access, what you want them to be allowed to do. Now that your APIs are facing outside, you both talked about SDKs being maybe one way of abstraction there. Any other tips or tools for as advice to consider when your APIs or SDKs are going to be public facing that may not be obvious to a team that was mostly developing and setting up their security and auth for internal consumption?
Yeah, I think from my own experience, I think one good learning and one good practice we've built is around having at least some sort of security model thinking early on in the development process of your APIs, and to keep it simple, because those models can get very complicated very quickly, and then we run into more complex code, which is just unnecessary. So just trying to keep it simple. But I think once you start having that model, you build out your APIs. We've partnered with our security teams or third-party security teams to do audits as well. So maybe as vulnerability or pen tests, penetration tests over our APIs, SDKs, and the platform gives us that level of confidence about being able to open up these sort of APIs and products outside, essentially. So something that has worked well for us.
Makes sense. And the common theme there, Rajeev, sounds to be around introducing that team early. Anything that you may have done around sort of doing things like audits or pen testing before the development or during the model defining stage?
We've definitely, I mean, as part of our DevOps processes itself, we've included activities for code checks and security checks and all of those sort of things, right? But there's this peer review that goes on. All of that activity does happen, but when, you know, there's always that one edge case that always slips, and having a third party or a third person looking at it from a different point of view is always very helpful.
Yeah, makes sense. How about you, Amy? Any thoughts on that?
It's very similar. Like include everything about authentication and authorization early, because the last thing that you want to do is let something outside of your company that doesn't require that and doesn't take that into consideration. So always have that. Admittedly, I didn't have to deal with the pen test per se, because that was the team that provides the authentication and authorization had to do that. I just actually implemented it. But it's so important to know that when it's happened, that they are happening, that you are auditing access to make sure that nothing is slipping through the cracks. And I guess one of the things that we've learned is that handling client access can also be overwhelming. So, figuring out a process and a way to deal with that, and that can be done in a timely manner, right? There's nothing like somebody who wants access to try to use something, and it takes them like a week or 2 weeks or maybe longer to get access. There's nothing like ruining that excitement. So, the more that you can think about that up front, about not only about the authorization and authentication, but thinking about what is that process going to look like is important as well.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. So we have maybe time for one more question. And Azan has asked a question around, how do you make the time for your engineering teams to work on the actual SDKs or APIs when engineering has a collaboration component that takes most of the working day, i.e. meetings? So Amy, maybe in your case, you were doing this work before there was an SDK team. So maybe that would be helpful for Azan and others to know about how the team and the resources associated with putting that team together was prioritized.
Yeah, so that's great, pointing it out that way. We weren't a team to begin with, that everybody was doing this as like a side job or their extra night job, or something that they would steal away time to do. And Autonomic decided to really invest in having a team that did SDKs, and that was their primary focus, because there's always other things that can be done. I think there's good and bad points to it. I love having a team that's just focused on the end user and doing that, but it also may be good to also have the core team to do it. But when you definitely have that side problem, that time problem, standing up a whole nother team that's their focus, really opens things up and gets things done.
Makes sense. And then we all work in the enterprise world, and there's probably some correlation between the number of meetings that happens when we work in the enterprise realm versus when we've worked at startups ourselves. Any tips from either of you on how to try and reduce that or how to manage those?
I think the pandemic has sort of made it easier to reduce the noise that you want. It's totally up to how the team leader, engineering manager wants to manage this sort of ecosystem. I still remember when we first got into, when the whole pandemic started and we all went remote, every small question became a team meeting, and that became like our whole calendars were just blocked with questions that need to be answered. But very quickly, I think the team adapted to, because of the noise that was being generated and not being able to focus, like take out just office hours, right? Or letting the team know that I'm not going to be talking to anybody from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. because I'm going to be coding or writing code or whatever it is. And they turn off their Slack. That would be a sign for everybody to know that, not, please don't disturb me right now, or don't reach out to. But then you keep these office hour type things during the week where people can collaborate. So that's sort of some of the practices we've adopted in the team.
Awesome. Anything to add there, Amy?
You know, I think, anytime that you have too many meetings, you're not able to get your core work done. I think it's always time for a conversation to see, are they truly needed? We've never been a very, from a team perspective, we've never been a big culture of meetings. We try to make ourselves available over Slack. We use WebEx Teams and a variety of different tools to be in constant communication with each other very quickly, and reaching out and getting a question answered. And I appreciate that, because I think if people are available to talk to each other when they have a problem quickly, then no meetings are needed. I admittedly will try to take the hit as the manager of the team to attend more meetings, or to try to figure out who needs to actually go to a meeting versus inviting everyone to it, and maybe wrecking a day. But I love the idea, and we do that too, as well as like let's divide our day into parts. This is where I code. This is when I'm available. I think that's helpful as well.
Awesome. Well, with that, we are at time, and hopefully you don't have a 1 o'clock meeting to go to, but we may. I want to thank you both so much. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I'm glad that we got to hang out and share some of the things we've learned with the broader community. And if there's anything else that folks in the audience want to find out about it, reach out to myself, Ashok at integral.io, or to our team at hello@integral.io, and we'll be able to help you with more. Thanks again.
All right, thanks for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, Amy. Bye.